Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Shubhajit, begin by telling us what these last 48 hours have been like for Bangladesh. Tell us what people have been watching on their TV and mobile screens.
Well, I have been covering Bangladesh for almost 2 decades now, and I've spoken to people who have seen Bangladesh over the last 50 years since it's been born. These are truly some of the most dramatic, chaotic scenes on Dhaka streets that we have seen ever.
That's Indian Express's diplomatic affairs editor Shubhajit Roy, and we'll be talking to him about the Bangladesh crisis, a topic to which we are dedicating this entire episode.
In the last 24 to 48 hours, we saw people defying curfew orders, people getting killed for that. Almost 100 people got killed in one day because there was violence on the streets. And that led to this unprecedented protest march to Dhaka. And the call was given over social media on Sunday. And on Monday morning, there was a curfew in Dhaka, but people came out on the streets and the police and the army refused to fire at them. And that's how the crowd just grew. They swelled by late morning, by 11:30. The situation was clear that people were just marching towards the Prime Minister's residence, and the army, Pakistan security establishment, they advised the Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina to leave her residence and possibly leave the country so that she could be safe. And she had exactly 45 minutes to wrap up, to pack, and that was when it dawned on the world that Sheikh Hasina was, after 16 and a half years of being Prime Minister, is going to be no more Bangladesh's Prime Minister. So it was truly unprecedented, historic in Bangladesh. This is for the first time a democratically elected leader had to flee the country because there were protests on the streets.
On Monday, thousands of people ransacked the Prime Minister's house, stealing everything from food to furniture. These scenes were very similar to what we had seen in Sri Lanka back in 2022.
In 2022, again, I was there in Colombo when I saw people had entered the presidential palace of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was the Sri Lankan president back then, and similar scenes where people were sort of sitting around in these lavish, high-ceiling halls with extravagant paintings and sofas and furniture, and people were taking away stuff or people were taking a dip in the pool. This time there was a small little lake inside the Bangladesh Prime Minister's residence. People were taking a dip there and people were carrying fish and her suitcase, which is a Dior suitcase, and generally items. So there was like a looting by the mob which had entered the Prime Minister's residence as part of the protesters.
And Shubhajit, Bangladesh had been witnessing student protests for the past 5 weeks or so. For those who may not know, could you talk about what these protests were about?
So the current round of protests started in June this year. Bangladesh had a reservation system, quota system in government jobs where 30% of the government jobs are reserved for families of freedom fighters, essentially people who fought for the freedom in 1971. Now, as you would realize, it's a young country. It's a 53-year-old country. So earlier, the families meant children of the freedom fighters. But even those children have now grown up. So now it includes even the grandchildren of freedom fighters. So what happened was, over a period of time, the ruling party, which is the Awami League, which is founded by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the founder of Bangladesh, or father of the nation, and her daughter, Sheikh Hasina. They carry the mantle of this freedom struggle in Bangladesh. So Sheikh Hasina's party members, the political leaders and sort of activists, they were part of this ecosystem whose families actually were benefiting from these quotas. So whether they fought for the freedom or not, the political parties' leaders, their families became the beneficiaries. So for the common people on the street, that entitlement of the ruling party really annoyed them, really irked them, because they felt that they were missing out on opportunities on these jobs because children or grandchildren of a freedom fighter who is actually a leader in the ruling party or in the government, he or she is getting the benefits, whereas I am not getting the benefit.
Right, and when the students started protesting, one of the things that Sheikh Hasina said, and I'm quoting here, she said, if the grandchildren of the freedom fighters don't get quota benefits, should the grandchildren of Razakars get the benefit? Now, this sparked a lot of outrage. Could you tell us what this term Razakar means?
So, Razakars is a pejorative, is the biggest insult in Bangladesh society. It has no equivalence in our culture, maybe. In Bangladesh, it is unique because Razakar means, so when in 71, when the freedom struggle was taking place, people of Bangladesh, of East Pakistan, and then East Pakistan were struggling or waging a war against their own government, which is the East Pakistan government. At that point of time, there were some people who were on the side of the East Pakistan government and the Pakistan army. So these people who were pro-Pakistan, pro-government, they were seen as collaborators of the government. So Razakars essentially means collaborators. Razakar means traitors or anti-nationals, if you want to give a similar framing from Indian perspective. So essentially what she was trying to say is that when she was asked this question on 4th of July, after she came back from a trip to China, she held a press conference where she was asked by a journalist about these students' quota protests and how they're protesting against these quotas in jobs which are reserved for families of freedom fighters. That's when she gave this comment that if it doesn't go to the grandchildren of freedom fighters, should it go to the grandchildren of Razakars? Essentially, this was seen as labeling the protesters as Razakars or as collaborators / traitors / anti-nationals. So from that perspective, protesters got even more angry, and it was amplified by the opposition parties. So the BNP and the Jamaat-e-Islami Bangladesh, they amplified this, and the students felt insulted, humiliated. They became a slogan that we wanted our rights and we were labeled as traitors or anti-nationals or collaborators. So that sort of gave a fresh lease of life to the protest movement.
And talk about how the Sheikh Hasina government reacted to these protests.
So, Sheikh Hasina government in the last 15 years, it has gone after the terror groups. It went after the benefactor of some of these terror groups, which is one of the political parties, Jamaat-e-Islami Bangladesh. Then it banned Jamaat-e-Islami Bangladesh. Then it got emboldened and went after the opposition, which is Bangladesh Nationalist Party, led by former Prime Minister and leader Begum Khaleda Zia, who is now unwell. So she jailed Khaleda Zia. She went after a lot of the leaders in the opposition. Then she went after the dissenting voices in the civil society and in the media. So that became her playbook. That's how she knew to handle any opposition to her ruling.
Right. In fact, many point out that the consecutive elections in 2014, 2018, and 2024 were allegedly rigged because of the kind of clampdown that the opposition parties were facing.
Yes, in fact, 2024 was boycotted by the opposition, as well as the elections 2013-14 were also boycotted by the opposition because of this high-handedness that one saw. And also there were other issues regarding the caretaker government and all of that. So as a result, what happened was she used the same playbook that she's been using for the last decade and a half to go after this round of protests, thinking that that's how she will be able to deal with these protesters. Now, these were young students. They are young and aspirational society. In fact, there are about 170 million people in Bangladesh, of which at least two-thirds are young people. So when you're dealing with a young society, which is aspirational, there's lack of jobs, lack of employment, lack of opportunities. In fact, for the Bangladesh civil services, for which these quotas are there are about 2,000 to 3,000 seats. And do you know how many people write the exam? There are about 4 lakh people who write the exam for 2,000 to 3,000 seats. So this anger was there on the street, and she saw this brutal crackdown. They unleashed that through the police. And that's how she dealt with it in the last, since June, July. And in July, things became really worse when almost 200 people, even her own government estimates 150 to 200 people, were killed on the streets. And these were all young people. The unofficial estimates put the number much higher. And on Sundays, on the weekend, Saturday, Sunday, when the protests took place, in that 24 hours, 100 people were killed. And many of them were killed not just by the police's or brutalities, because they refused to crack down at some point. So she unleashed the student wing or the youth wing of her party, Awami League's party, armed them with sticks and weapons, who went after the protesters. So there were like bloody, violent clashes on the streets over the weekend where all more than 100 people died. So you can imagine how bloody the situation had become. And that led to the last day on Monday, when the call for a march was given, people just came out of their homes. So the scenes were visible there to anyone. And I was in touch with people on the ground, and they were saying situation is fast changing. That was what they were saying. And they could see that people were coming out of the streets. And the most important thing was the police, the army, they refused to fire at these student protesters.
Right, and this is interesting because the Bangladeshi army has played a crucial role in supporting the governments in the past. It has had very close ties with the Hasina government. And while they had not come out politically to support her, some of the top army leaders have been her loyalists. So talk about the significance of them not shooting at the protesters in the end, choosing not to follow her government's orders.
So at some point, this loyalty from the army chiefs also had an expiry date, because ultimately it was a conscience issue that you don't want to fire at your own people. And especially when you see the scale of protests, because it's politically orchestrated or inspired, you can see common people coming out on the streets because they felt aggrieved that innocent people, innocent students were killed because of the mishandling by Hasina government in the first place in the last few weeks. So the army therefore saw that their position would become untenable if they fired at these students, these young people. So that's why that they advised her to pack her bags in 45 minutes. And because they could tell that, these protesters were marching towards her residence and they would ransack them. And without use of force, they would not be able to stop these protesters. So that's when they asked her to leave her residence and the country for her own safety.
Right, and her resigning is really the end of an era for Bangladesh, and we've spoken about the criticisms that she has faced. There have been political opponents who have been arrested, there have been forced disappearances, alleged extrajudicial killings, a crackdown on press freedoms and NGOs, but she's also credited for the economic rise that the country has seen over the past decade. So, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so Bangladesh, at one point, it was called a basket case by Western economists, and famously, I think it was the US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. That was a popular saying, that it was so poor and underdeveloped as a country. And when after Sheikh Hasina came to power in 2008, she provided stability in terms of governance, and therefore economic growth happened. And people, as I said, that there are about 170 million people, younger population, and very aspirational population. And they really sort of worked hard, and their garment industry became really the cutting edge, gave a run for money to the Indian counterparts, textile industry. And the garment industry was exporting to Europe, to US, all over the world. They also had a lot of people working in the Gulf who were sending a lot of remittances. So all in all, the government was able to ensure that there was good political stability, which could fuel economic growth.
Bangladesh has rapidly grown over the past decades,
continuously clocking in GDP growth rates of around 6 to 7% annually.
Today, Bangladesh is one of the world's largest garment exporters, with the RMG ready-made garment sector accounting for 85% of the country's exports and contributing 9% to GDP.
In fact, it has grown so well in the last 15 years that in the next couple of years, I think by 2026. So Bangladesh is right now, according to the World Bank and IMF's definition, it's the least developed country. But its per capita income is now higher than India's. So in the next couple of years, by 2026, it will make a transition to a developing country, which is at par with India. So that kind of a transition and economic growth is what Hasina's 15-16 years of governance really ensured. But obviously the downside was she was becoming much more authoritarian, and her respect for human rights were diminishing with each passing year.
Okay, so Sheikh Hasina resigns on Monday and flies out of the country, and the country she flies to is India. Talk about her reasons for doing that, because this is not the first time that she's come to India for her safety.
Yeah, so to circle back to history, 1975, she and her sister Sheikh Rihanna, by the way, both of them are again together in India, this time as well. So on 15th of August in 1975, Sheikh Mujib and his entire family, 7 members of the family, including Sheikh Hasina's mother, father obviously Sheikh Mujib, her brothers, as young as 10-year-old, the youngest brother, whose name was Russell, and Russell was named after Bertrand Russell, who Sheikh Mujib used to admire as a philosopher. So they were all killed in Dhaka. Sheikh Hasina and Sheikh Rihanna, the 2 sisters, were actually in Germany at that point of time, and they had left just few days before the assassination took place. So that's how they escaped from being assassinated at that point of time. Otherwise, the entire family would have been assassinated. So at that point of time, the Indian embassy in Germany, they actually took care of them, and she came to India at that point of time, and she stayed in Delhi, in Pandara Park, in Pandara Road, where the Indian government gave her shelter, gave her refuge. And at that point of time, there was a Janta government. Later, Indira Gandhi came to power. So, across the political divide, the Indian government, Indian political leadership took care of her. Story goes that Pranab Mukherjee was the former president. He and his wife, Shubhra Mukherjee, used to take care of her as their own family member. So they would cook for her and they would take care of her. So really, India became her second home.
And was she staying in the country under a different name?
That's also one of the legends of the story, is that she was staying under a different name incognito because of the threat to her life. And Shubhra Mukherjee used to introduce her as one of her relatives, a sister or a cousin or something like that, So that's the kind of relationship she had with India, India's leaders, irrespective of political affiliation. And she stayed here for 5-6 years. Her kids went to school here. Her daughter was nicknamed Putul, and the son Joy, they did elementary school here. So she has lived here in Delhi. She's been a Delhi kid, in that sense. So India has been her second home.
Right, and after she went back to Bangladesh, she took charge of the party, took charge of her father's legacy, and eventually became the Prime Minister. And in 2008, 2009, when she was in power in Bangladesh, here in India, it was the UPA which was in power. And the Gandhi family knew her, and Pranab Mukherjee, who she had stayed with, was in the government. Was that kind of the peak for India-Bangladesh ties?
So that's where really it took off. And because just before that, between 2001 and 2006, when Bangladesh Nationalist Party under Khaleda Zia and Jamaat-e-Islami Bangladesh, when they were in power for 5-6 years, there was large-scale attacks against India, which were sort of backed by Jamaat-e-Islami. And there were anti-India terror outfits which were operating from Bangladesh with impunity. And there were attacks on India. So India had that bitter experience with the opposition forces, opposition party. So when Sheikh Hasina came back to power, it was a fresh ray of hope. She kind of changed it around. So what happened was she went after these terror groups, which were anti-India. India and Bangladesh became really close because both were fighting against terrorism and religious extremism. As a flip side, what happened was she was using that opportunity also crack down against Jamaat-e-Islami Bangladesh, which was a political party at that point of time, but a radical Islamic extremist political party. So is using it for her political reasons. India and Bangladesh, that's where it became closer. They, in fact, started negotiating the land boundary agreement. They resolved the land boundary agreement. There was a maritime boundary dispute, which was adjudicated by the International Tribunal. And the judgment came in favor of Bangladesh, in which India lost a bit of maritime territory, but India agreed, accepted it. That was because India and Bangladesh under Hasina really became strategic allies and partners. And that was a really defining moment. And the most interesting part was that land boundary agreement was negotiated by the Congress government when the BJP was in opposition. And BJP was opposing that agreement. But when BJP came to power in 2014 under Narendra Modi, they changed their position and they supported the agreement and they signed the agreement.
Right, and since then there has been a bipartisan consensus towards having good relations with Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina. And even besides strong diplomatic ties, India has also supported Bangladesh monetarily over the years. Talk about some of those instances and also the kind of progress we have seen when it comes to trade.
So India gave billions of dollars as lines of credit in projects, infrastructure projects in Bangladesh. It also invested in power grid to supply power there. It also was working with Bangladesh in getting the transit rights from West Bengal through Bangladesh to Northeast India. Otherwise, Indians right now have to take the entire cargo goods through a circuitous route, through the chicken's neck, through Darjeeling, and then through Assam, and to reach a place like Manipur or Meghalaya or Tripura. It's a much circuitous route. But because there was such a good relationship, that transit was finally being possible, so India could access its own parts much easily, northeastern India. And Bangladesh, which is actually surrounded by India from three sides, and it is 4,000 plus kilometers of boundary, which actually is the longest boundary India has with any neighbor. Not with China, not with Pakistan. We don't realize because the map is so small, it looks so small. So it was in Bangladesh's interest to have a good relationship with India. It was in India's interest to have good relationship with Bangladesh, and Bangladesh under Hasina cooperated fully with India on what India felt were important to itself, which includes countering terrorism, religious extremism, and connectivity, which is the transit to northeastern India.
And Shubhajit, what does this moment mean for India now? Because she's taken refuge in India at a time when a large section of Bangladeshis are really angry with her. Talk about the challenges this poses for New Delhi.
Well, India obviously is in a tight spot because it had put all its eggs in the Hasina basket. She was their go-to person. She was their trusted friend, ally, partner, you call whatever, because of the convergences in ideas and how they saw the future together. So now Dhaka will have people who will be sort of ruled by the opposition parties who are her rivals and who also see India as backing Hasina and have shunned them all these 15 years. So that puts India in a difficult position where this anti-Hasina feeling can translate into anti-India sentiment as well. So that's a big diplomatic challenge.
And Shubhajit, although she is in India right now, there are talks that she wants to go to the UK. Is that something that would be possible for her?
So my understanding is that the UK immigration rules don't allow her to seek political asylum while she's out of the country. The person has to be in the country, in UK, to apply for asylum or refuge in the UK. She doesn't have a visa to enter UK right now. She had a diplomatic passport or an official passport till yesterday, which after she left office, she resigned as a prime minister. She doesn't have. She is a normal citizen like you and me, like any other Bangladeshi citizen. So she has to get a visa, enter UK, and then seek asylum or refuge. But that cannot happen unless she gets there. And she's seeking asylum with the sole purpose of that she believes that she will face persecution politically if there are probes, investigations against her which are opened in Bangladesh. So that's why she came to India before she could go to the UK. Obviously, she didn't think this through, and because it happened so rapidly, this tells you that it happened so rapidly. She didn't have a plan B. So now she's in India, and my understanding is that India would not abandon her, and she will stay in India as long as it takes. If she decides to stay in India for a longer period before she figures out her plans, she can stay in India till she wants, because Indian government believes or feels that this is our partner. We cannot abandon her.
I mean, usually in diplomacy, you support whichever government is in power. You're not partisan. For example, the Conservative Party or the Labour Party in the UK are not BJP supporters. They would want to develop ties with the Indian government. What would this decision mean for India, that it's supporting one political player?
It will be a difficult challenge, Shashank, because obviously the ruling establishment in Dhaka would definitely not view this kindly. But I think India will have to navigate this challenging task of not abandoning a friend and yet working with whoever are the new players in Dhaka. So it will be an extremely tough tightrope walk for India in the next few weeks, months to come. So that's where we are. So we don't know how long will she stay here, when is she going to get to another destination. But India will have to find a safe place for her. And I'm told the government is looking at possible options to accommodate her, to keep her safe in India. It could be a safe house, it could be a nondescript place, but it's hard to keep a person of her profile in a secluded place. She's not some, writer or a activist who you can keep in a safe house in a neighborhood. She needs proper security. There will be people who would be needed to guard her. And so those elements now are part of the discussion, will come into play. And the situation is fluid, it's dynamic. We don't know how long will she stay. But what we definitely do know, that India is going to give her safe space and refuge as long as it takes.
And does that mean that India believes that she still might have a political future in Bangladesh?
That we don't know. She may have, because Awami League is still a bona fide political party. We don't know whether she has political goodwill on the ground or not. But Awami League is a political party, and there are other leaders in the political party. And her son is still young. Her daughter is young. I'm sure questions like these would have been asked when Hasina was here for the first time, whether India believes that, and she at that point of time wouldn't have been in a mind space to think about her political future. She's also old. She's 76. So we don't know how future is in the next 5 years, if a new government is there in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, or what happens now, if the army takes control. So a lot of variables there in the scheme of things. But we do know that Hasina as a person, as an individual, is going to remain a friend of India. And India has taken a call that it will not abandon its friend.
And Shubhajit, as we speak, there have been announcements that an interim government headed by the Nobel laureate Professor Muhammad Yusuf will be taking oath. And meanwhile, India has recalled non-essential staff from its High Commission and consulates in the country. But with this current political instability, is there a worry that China or Pakistan could take advantage of this moment?
Absolutely. There's a real concern, worry in the Indian establishment, Indian government, that countries which would benefit from this particular situation where, the government will be not really, favorable to Indian interests, could be China, Pakistan, could be getting an advantage, even Turkey, some analysts say. But, Bangladesh, by virtue of the geography, as it is surrounded by India, by three sides, that brings to the center the relationships imperatives that, strategically, it has to work with India. There is no other way. So, in terms of commerce, in terms of trade, in terms of humanitarian aid, in terms of infrastructure support, Bangladesh does need India. And India also needs a stable, peaceful, prosperous Bangladesh. So India will deal with whoever is in power there. And Bangladesh, whoever is in power, would also know that they have to deal with India. And there might be challenges, there might be sort of rough edges, but they will have to work with the Indian establishment for their own benefit. So I think it's a situation which will play out in the next few weeks, months, and how the new power players in the government, how they deal with India. So that will tell us. So right now, that's a dynamic situation.
You were listening to Three Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.